Tiffany Harris, criminal defense attorney.
Hello, Out Bosses. Rhodes Perry here, and welcome to this week's episode of the Out Entrepreneur, a weekly podcast where I get to interview today's most inspiring LGBTQ bosses crushing it in business. On this week's episode, I am really excited to introduce you all to my friend and fellow Out Boss, Tiff Harris. Tiff, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Rhodes. Great to be here.
Yeah, it's great having you. So I know outside of Portland, some folks might not be as familiar with your awesome work. So I'd love just to give our audience a little background on who you are, and then we'll jump into the questions. So Tiff Harris is the founder of Harris Defense, a private criminal defense law practice working in federal court and counties throughout the state of Oregon. She graduated from the University of Oregon School of Law, where she secured a fellowship with the Wayne Morse Center for Law and Politics. She worked as an associate attorney at Schwabe, Williamson, and Wyatt. Hopefully I pronounced that correctly.
Close enough.
Thank you. And as a lead staff for the Oregon Senate's Committee on Rules and Elections during the 2005 legislative session. In 2007, she went to the Metropolitan Public Defender, and she also served on the Legal Advisory Board for Basic Rights Oregon for 10 years. Tiffany enjoys hiking, jogging, and cheering for her beloved Portland Thorns. So, Tiff, I'm sure you're kind of bummed because the Thorns are not playing. So we'll
not in any way that we can watch them live. No.
I know. So that's the world we find ourselves in. So we'll get there. We'll talk about the world as it is and how it's impacting business. I'd love to start off and have you kind of walk us through highlights from your professional journey. I mean, it's clear you've had an amazing legal career and you've worked for some very established groups, organizations. And, what was the moment where you decided to kind of break away from these organizations and start out on your own in your own legal practice?
Well, I'm definitely not someone who has had a long-standing entrepreneurial impulse. And I think I really wound up managing my own law practice through some twists and turns that were unexpected, but just part of an arc, a career arc that I have. And so when I was in law school, I graduated in 2002, and the economy was still really booming back then. And the big sort of marquee regional law firms in the Pacific Northwest would set up shop on campus, and you could apply for an on-campus interview. And, that was a very sort of grades-driven, mechanical process. And I sort of wormed my way on. I think I wasn't like a top pick, but they fit me in during a lunch break or something. And I do remember borrowing a friend's outfit. We literally swapped during a break because she was interviewing with firms also. So we switched clothes in the bathroom of the law school, and I had to stuff toilet paper in her shoes because I, of course, was wearing like these girl pumps or something because I did not own my own. So anyway, after the costume change, I went and I did the interview, and they decided to offer me it's called a summer clerkship. It's like a summer job between academic years of law school. And that in the old days, when law firms had these kind of bloated budgets and they could wine and dine you and have you do all this fun, neat stuff, that was sort of like the tryout period. And they would wow you and you would try to wow them and be like the most productive, capable legal writer and researcher they'd ever met in their lives. And if you both decided it was a match, then they would offer you a full-time job, which they did. So I worked at this very conventional kind of full-service business law firm for 5 years. And, I remember just from an LGBTQ perspective, it was such a different world back then. And I was in a very serious relationship. My girlfriend was moving out from New York that might sound familiar to some people.
A little bit.
Moving out to live with me. So as someone who'd never had a law job, I'm just graduating from law school. It was incumbent on me to ask them, do you offer this kind of employment-related benefit? And their answer was, let us check. We've never been asked. And I remember feeling really insecure about the fact that I was the one bringing it up. And I guess they did a bunch of, sort of insurance gymnastics, and they were able to cobble together some individualized plan or something for me. I don't remember the details, but I remember it being sort of a first and thinking, God, this is going to be weird. So, but I would say that, as a lawyer, it was a good experience. There were a lot of really smart and nice people. It just became clear to me over time that this was not going to really sustain my passion and interest over the long haul, especially given how demanding the work was. I mean, I remember coming home every night saying, gosh, if I'm going to be this stressed out, I wish I weren't so bored. So I got a chance to take a leave of absence and go work for the legislature, specifically for the woman who's now our governor, Kate Brown. And the interesting backstory was that in Oregon, we'd been trying for something like 30 years to pass just a basic state level guarantee that you wouldn't be discriminated against in housing, employment, or public accommodations on the basis of your sexual orientation or gender identity. And again, I mean, it seems like a no-brainer, although it hasn't been without complications. But in 2005, that was still a very high-risk proposition for Democrats in Oregon. So Kate decided that she was going to drive this bill. It was going to be heard in her committee. She was going to be taking the lead and championing the bill through the legislative process. So I got to work with her committee while she was doing this. And as a young lawyer, it was so interesting, was so captivating. And frankly, it was so bizarre to see all of these people flood the Capitol building. People who'd never gotten on the bus to talk to their legislators about any goddamn thing before in their entire lives. And to hear them speaking like from these really weird talking points about what they thought the law would do, what they thought was in the law, having no idea, right, of what the law actually said or was. And I remember as a young lawyer thinking, God, I guess this happens a lot. But, in my rarefied environment at the big firm, I'd never seen the law be so opaque and misunderstood by regular people. And that was a hugely formative experience. And then when I got back to the law firm, I was like, wow, what seemed like a little bit of a boring grind before just felt like there's no way. So I left and I took a job at the public defender's office, and I loved it. And I had an opportunity after a couple of years to work with a lawyer on a really high stakes, several weeks long trial in Central Oregon. So I left to pursue that opportunity. And I still kind of regret it in some ways because the environment at the public defender's office was so fierce and so marvelous, and I still miss it. But after that departure, then I went out on my own, and I've been handling state and federal cases, court-appointed. I would say the majority of them court-appointed cases. And I just work out of my little groovy downtown office.
Yeah. I love, thank you for kind of taking us through the cliff notes of your career and, these decision points, early on, the signals of, the big firm that, was not prepared to respond to your question about, just domestic partner benefits, how you can take care of your partner, and that you were you felt like you were the first, and that felt not like that you necessarily, that there was a place for you where you could truly be yourself. And I think that you kind of follow those breadcrumbs. You got that opportunity to work with, now Governor Kate Brown on legislation, that would change a law, several laws, to improve the lives of LGBTQ people. And that was something that lit you up of, and also, as you said, that kind of legal literacy of making sure that people understood, like, here's what the law means and here's how it impacts your life. And then kind of going to the public defender where that's, I, as a layperson, not a lawyer, that's my impression, is like you're there to kind of stand up for folks who might have been accused of something, to understand, this is what this means. Here's what your options are, and being there for them is huge. And so now you're doing that on your own in your own practice. So you're focusing specifically on defending folks who've been accused of violating criminal and regulatory laws. So walk us through some of this legal literacy here, so not everyone in our audience may understand what that means. So share with us what that means and why you spend your best waking hours doing the work that you do.
Well, just because of the sort of moment that we're in, we're about to have a hugely consequential election. We've been kind of grieving ever since the murder of George Floyd and outraged, and we've been sort of reconsidering what it means to have a criminal justice system and a system of policing in this country. I've been thinking about things more broadly these days. And so to your question specifically, Rhodes, my work on behalf of people in the court system who have a lawyer appointed to them because they can't afford one. It's funny, when you think about it, it's still kind of a new system. John Kennedy signed the Criminal Justice Act into law in 1963. That was really the foundation for guaranteeing people a lawyer when they were charged with a crime, but it really wasn't fully funded and operationalized. It didn't really become part of the federal bureaucracy until 1970, when essentially, the judicial branch kind of created an office, like a sort of a federal defender office. And that is kind of our part of the government bureaucracy. It funds our work. It makes sure that if you're indicted, a big felony case in federal court, there's DNA, there are witnesses we need to locate and interview. You now have a constitutional right to effective counsel. And that means, someone who is meeting professional standards. It's not just a right that you have based on kind of being a consumer. This is enshrined in the Constitution. You get an effective advocate. And what we've kind of learned in modern times is that having an effective advocate means having enough funding so that I can mount a defense on all the fronts that I need to do. So, if I need to have DNA retested, if I need to go travel to another state to talk with your foster mom about your mental health, all of those expenses must be met by the government. And that's really kind of a modern creation. But I'm part of that system, and I'm proud to be part of that system. It's just work that, compared to the work that I was first doing as a younger lawyer, it's work that to me feels important, fascinating, oftentimes emotionally very trying. But at the end of the day, it's work that I'm really proud to do.
Yeah. I appreciate that background. To me, when you say this is a modern creation, in terms of public defense, it's like, really? Like, I always,
I know.
This is just me and my ignorance of just thinking that was a part of kind of trial by jury and, the original framing of the Constitution, which was really wrong. So thank you for that. I'm sure that that's helped other people kind of hopefully wrap their mind around the important work that you're doing. On your website and knowing about you like to kind of grapple with these very complex challenges, problems, however you want to frame them, right? And so how does this, and I think you're very gifted at doing that, just hearing you talk about some issues that are challenging. Yeah. So talk to me a little bit more about the TIFF factor. I think that this is something that you bring into your practice that allows you to deliver results for your clients that you're defending. So what is that? Is that from your legal training? Is that, how did you hone that skill?
Well, there are lots of skills that I think are really important to being a good lawyer. And I think different lawyers emphasize the ones that, where they're strongest. And I grew up in a family of lawyers. My mother went to law school when she was raising 4 kids as a single mom. And so my oldest sister was in high school. I was in like 2nd or 3rd grade or something when my mom started law school. She graduated in 1980 I think when I was in about 3rd or 4th grade is when she graduated. That's right. And my mom was a little bit too old to be sort of kind of a footloose and fancy-free flower child. Like, she had kids already. She had a lot of family responsibilities, obviously. She was still married to my dad, and she had 4 of us. And so she couldn't on a dime decide to become like a feminist trailblazer, but she eventually did. You know, I think intellectually she was probably tilting in that direction, but she eventually made for her what was probably like one of the most important decisions in her life. And I think she was, again, like shaped by a lot of those things that were happening in her formative adult years. I remember, I have like a vague memory, and I don't know if it comes from storytelling or if it's my own memory of her binge watching the Watergate hearings and smoking cigarettes and having her mind blown about what the law can do in this country. You know, the law unseated the president who back then was the most corrupt executive actor we'd ever had in our history. And our system of laws made that happen. I think that was really meaningful for my mom. I think it was part of her inspiration to go to law school. And she did it at an enormous sacrifice, and it made a huge impression on all of us. You know, I was the youngest, and I think I kind of had this mix of like, on the one hand, I just wish she could be like the other moms and like volunteer at my school and do shit like that. And she would like bungle the carpools and leave us stranded places, and because it was just like too much shit to do, you know. And I have so much empathy for her now. I can't even believe what she managed to accomplish. But back when you're like in, you know, third grade and you and your friend are just waiting at the soccer field for the ride, it's kind of like, oh God, sorry about this. But you know, but so that was, it just made a huge impression. And then I guess in answer, to the question about the TIF factor, there's this notion of, you know, this is a family vocation. All of my siblings are attorneys. All four of us grew up to be lawyers. There is something in certain families have something in their DNA. And I would say that is part of what the Harris kids do. There's that. And I do also think that, you know, my mom died when I was in high school, but she was sick for kind of the second half of high school. And then she died at the beginning of my senior year. And my siblings sort of moved, a couple of them were already there. A couple of them moved back into the house so that I could finish high school and live in the house that I'd been living in, and just sort of like have a stable conclusion to my K through 12 education and avoid like the harshest effects of that whole experience. You know, we rallied together as a family and they took care of me. But I would say that experience of being so perilously close to a bad outcome has really shaped my approach to connecting with clients, to understanding just a little bit, right? Because I wasn't living in poverty. I wasn't living necessarily like in the lap of luxury either, but I had minimal things that were sort of guaranteed and taken care of. But that experience of kind of being part of a essentially orphaned group, we had a dad, but he wasn't really tethered to us. That experience of almost reaching a breaking point and kind of being clawed back from the brink, that has really helped me at least imagine what life is like for some of my clients. Yeah. And I would say that's probably it's the origin story, and it's that experience is part of the TIF factor that you're describing, I guess. Yeah. I really appreciate that. I think that last piece of what you're sharing is from your lived experiences, being able to have the ability to empathize with the folks that you're working with, and not being able to necessarily understand everything, but being able to connect, from one human being to another, and seeing the dignity in the clients that you're working with, I'm sure builds trust and rapport pretty quickly at a time, in the lives of your clients that I can only imagine how scary, facing a criminal charge like at the level that they're facing can be, and working with such a professional like yourself, the TIF factor too, like the empathy plus like
growing up with such a strong mom who influenced not only you, but your three siblings. And, I can imagine conversations probably with people who have the law, debates. Like
still happens.
Yeah, it's got to be like very lively family discussions. So I'm sure that helps you, craft, your arguments when you're, before a judge, and really, the gravity of having people's lives, interdependent, not necessarily totally dependent on you, but like, the fact that you're making a case for them to have a pathway out of the criminal justice legal system, whatever you want to call it, you're doing that. And I want to touch on the large scale racial justice uprisings that you mentioned earlier in the conversation. The fact that we're in an economic downturn, COVID, everything, it's impacting how we connect, how we relate to each other, and recognizing that your law firm exists to defend people facing a criminal charge. How have these recent events impacted your work, and what role is your firm playing to address some of these larger social and economic challenges? And I know that you're one firm in this big, huge system, but how does it relate to your work? What are you doing?
In some ways, my focus hasn't shifted, in that my earliest experiences at the public defender's office were on behalf of people who were disproportionately affected by over-policing, mandatory minimum sentences, and a fundamental breakdown in our ability to imagine the circumstances under which another person is living. So that was like a constant in the work that I was doing before. I would say the difference between then and now, in the moment that you're describing, that we're talking about, is that now more people understand it.
Yeah.
And more people, I would say, expect and demand that we make those issues real to prosecutors, to judges who will be deciding our clients' fates. I mean, I personally, even though I practice in a field that's really contentious and adversarial, like temperamentally, I'm the youngest child. I'm an extrovert. I actually, I want people to like me. I don't like upsetting people. That's just sort of my innate temperament, right? But I am more emboldened now. I'm more emboldened to raise arguments about systemic racism. And I feel like I'm also more obligated, and so some of the differences are just sort of like my subjective experience of practicing in this world. This is the first time where I feel like people in the community sort of applaud our work. I feel like for so long, criminal defense lawyers have battled such a negative stereotype and kind of a suspect reputation. And God, I think I was like, getting a power bar at 7-Eleven, or was I getting a coffee? I can't remember. It was like right before the pandemic changed daily functions like that. And somehow I was, chatting up I think it was at Starbucks near my office, do you work around town? What do you do? Where's your office? That sort of thing. And so I think I was explaining that I was like a criminal defense lawyer, and the person stops and said, thank you for your work.
Yes.
No one ever used to say that. It would be so hard, to be able to cold call witnesses, who are important to my client's case. And you have to identify yourself as I'm a criminal defense lawyer, I represent so-and-so in this kind of situation. And it was such a conversation stopper. And so, I don't mean to make your question all about me, but for me, the larger implications of that is that, it makes me a little bit optimistic that this work can maybe be more transformative than it used to be. That's the hope that I'm holding out for right now.
Yeah. Are you seeing now, when you are kind of in the world that we're in, and however I'm imagining maybe you're connecting with judges and your clients and prosecutors through Zoom or else, I'm not sure what that looks like, but I mean, are you seeing, because of public pressure, because of public protest, that there's more of a willingness of judges in particular, and even prosecutors, and having that TIF factor, having that empathy of really trying to understand the gravity that whatever decision comes out of a legal proceeding will impact, that particular person, your client's life for the rest of their life. Do you see that kind of unraveling, or are people hardening?
Yeah. Some of it is untested, it's kind of to be determined. Like I have a case where I had a person who is being supervised by the federal court. The person has already completed a prison sentence and has stabilized many aspects of their life and has a full-time job and is acting as a single parent and is really doing everything that we're asking of a person who is reentering society. But this is a person who's African American, who lives in a community that I would say is over-policed, and who historically has just had trouble being outside of the glare of the police. And I feel an extra duty to try to accelerate this person's exit from court supervision.
Yeah.
Because we supervise, it's an unseen aspect of the criminal justice system, is the length of time that we surveil people after they have already, in common parlance, kind of served their sentence, paid their debt. They remain subject to all kinds of surveillance for so long. And for someone who is part of a community that I think is over-policed, the risk of reincarceration is high. And so in response to your question, this is going to come up. I want to put this in front of the court, and I want the court to do the right thing and to evaluate the progress that has been made. And it's not stellar. Nobody went to college and got an engineering degree. Nobody rescued a child that was drowning in the Willamette River. But day to day, this is a person who is meeting obligations under circumstances that are very, very trying. And I want that to be enough. And I'm going to make my best argument for why that should be enough. Mm-hmm. And why holding people to a standard that is unrealistic, given the circumstances in which they're living, why that can have a disproportionate impact on people living in poverty and people who are Black and brown. And so it's going to be difficult. I don't necessarily have an activist audience, in the federal court, but those are the kinds of more subtle and difficult arguments that have to be made, because we really need to do a better job of not just treating the acute harm that comes with a criminal arrest, an indictment, a prison sentence, but addressing kind of the longer term chronic harm and just bringing it to an end and giving the person a chance at a surveillance-free life.
Yeah. Yeah. It's going to be interesting to see how this plays out, over the next year, the next 5 years, maybe the next decade, in terms of greater understanding of how structural racism, where it exists, and in particular in the legal system, and how that will impact your work, and you are, just by virtue of doing what you do and making the cases that you do, case by case, with the judges you work with, in particular, the prosecutors, there's education happening in each and every one of those cases. And I think coupled with our country's reckoning, with structural racism, with, the internal racism that exists in so many of us, that maybe that's the silver lining for your work and for all of us, in this country and globally. I'm curious, when you think of your law firm and, bigger, thinking about our audience, LGBT owned businesses, what's the role that we can play in this moment of our national racial reckoning? How do we center racial justice in our own workplace culture, everyday practices? And I know it's you kind of running your firm, but thoughts on that, things that you see, things that you're doing, things that you're seeing other, LGBT owned businesses doing that might inspire our audience to dig a little bit deeper and doing more, just maybe one thing more if it feels out of reach.
That's a really good question. I mean, I don't employ anyone. I use a lot of service providers on a contractual basis.
Yeah.
But I'm not a typical workplace where, I'm sort of where I have oversight responsibility over employees. But I think the work that I do is something that gets done in concert with many other professionals. I work with interpreters. I work with legal investigators, social workers, all kinds of people. And one of the things that became very apparent to me, I'm sure other criminal defense people as well, is that because of the world that we inhabit now, a disproportionate number of our clients are Black and brown, but the service providers that we use, there's not a lot of representation in the universe of people who we employ to help with our clients' defense. There's not a lot of racial diversity, socioeconomic diversity, and of course that includes lawyers, right? We're like in Oregon, the Oregon State Bar is overwhelmingly white. And so one of the things that I try to do, and I don't know how applicable this is to your other listeners and people in your community, but is that I really have tried to integrate and involve more diverse viewpoints and service providers in the orbit of my client's defense team. And one sort of specific example, sometimes as part of our cases, if we're essentially striving for a more, let's say, restorative justice kind of conclusion to a case, and we need to consult with a victim. That's something that we have to do really carefully. We have to do it in accordance. If it's a state case, we have to do it in accordance with a lot of state rules that govern our ability to have direct contact with victims. But there are people that we can employ to help us do that. They're called like defense victim outreach specialists, essentially, because so many of the people who are also impacted by crime are also people of color. It was apparent to me that there was a dearth of people who could approach crime victims of color with adequate cultural competence. And so a couple of lawyers and others got together and created a training so that we could grow a bench of specialists who could be more culturally competent and be more racially diverse to occupy that role, because it's such an important role, because, this is sort of an ambassador to your defense team who's making contact with the victim of a crime. And to ignore the sort of racial underpinnings of that situation, is kind of irresponsible and just perpetuates a lot of the harm that's already been done to that person. So, sorry, I don't mean to be long-winded, but that's, I think the lesson maybe that could be applied to others is to really figure out what can you do structurally to make sure that the work you do, especially if you're doing it directly on behalf of other people, includes these communities. And if there isn't currently a spot, like how do you create that spot? What do you do to grow a bench? If it's a longer term process, like what can you do now? It's a lot of work,
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's great. You're talking about, kind of running your own firm, right? And that so you don't employ people, that there are so many touch points of people a part of your legal team, that help kind of usher a case from beginning to end. And, how do you make sure that that team reflects the folks that you're serving, primarily brown, Black folks that are going through the criminal justice system, even here in Oregon, that is a predominantly white state, right? So there's disproportionality. So how do you make sure that there is that cultural competence, responsiveness, intelligence, whatever you want to call it, like within the work that you do? And I think for other listeners, that might be a little bit easier because you do employ people, and think about the communities that you're serving, your markets, the people that are buying your stuff that you're serving with services themselves, are the people on your team reflective of those folks opting into what you offer? And if not, that's some of the internal work of discovering why, and what do you have to unpack yourself as a business leader to show up and to do better, because now you know better. You've got an example here. The world of work that you're in, it might be different than other folks who are not in the legal profession. So I appreciate that.
Yeah, and I don't mean to sound like self-congratulatory, because Oregon in our world, it's, I can only imagine what it's like. You're meeting your court-appointed lawyer for the first time. Everybody involved in the court system, pretty much, they're like a monolith of white people. Your lawyer's white. Maybe your case investigator is also white. Like this, it's just a sort of endless array of white people. And yet everybody you meet in jail, in the detention area at the, sort of U.S. Marshals, like detention place, the booking process, like, everybody's sort of on the other end of this process. And I don't mean everybody, but a majority of people are not white. And I just, there's so many aspects of the process kind of reinforce that disparity. And so if there's one little thing I can do, I try, but it's very difficult.
Yeah. And you're modeling for other folks in your space, right? And that's really important too. So I want to turn to something that you talked about before with your time working with now Governor Kate Brown on a bill that was 30 years in the making. Oh my God. So anyway, so just kind of like recognizing, laws and policies in this country have historically failed us, our rainbow family, LGBTQ people, communities, in all of the everyday aspects of life, which including going to school, getting a job, trying to get healthcare, trying to get a house or rent an apartment, getting credit, using a public accommodation. Like there's still a lot of laws and policies that are creating barriers, maybe not necessarily in the state of Oregon, though, maybe in certain cities and towns. So kind of how does the criminal defense work that you do every day help dismantle some of these legal barriers that make it difficult for many of us in the queer community to lead healthy and happy lives?
Well, I don't know. I mean, your question is like, how does my work as a criminal defense practitioner improve sort of the broader LGBTQ experience?
Yeah, if it applies,
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. I think probably just being out in the court system, being myself. In 2016, I was appointed to represent one of the defendants that was charged in connection with the takeover of the Malheur Wildlife Refuge. That got a little bit of national press. It was kind of a wackadoodle sort of experience. Ammon Bundy was the lead defendant. There were lots of press images of these folks armed at this previously unknown little bird sanctuary in Eastern Oregon. But that was quite an experience. All of the people, now, of course, this was a real test of like lots of our liberal buddies' commitment to the constitutional right to appointed counsel, because my deeply held conviction about that is that if I am a court-appointed lawyer and I'm appointed to represent you, I take all comers. You are my client. I owe you a duty of loyalty, confidentiality, and zealous advocacy, full stop. Like, that's it. So and that case was no different. However, like, was I aware that some of the people involved in that movement, like, had probably said unflattering things about queer people? Like, yeah, of course, never came up as far as my representation. I think once they got a taste of the fact that I was willing to work my ass off, I think they probably cared less. No one said boo to me. And I will tell you that I had lots and lots of conversations out in Eastern Oregon with lots and lots of militia types, and they were happy that I was working on behalf of my client, period. No one else, no one seemed to give a shit. I don't know what they said behind my back, but they were pleased to be interviewed as witnesses and to help and to interface with me as much as I needed them to. That said, I think in response to your question, I think it still probably matters that there are people who are out, who are unashamed of who they are, who are living their lives as, sort of fully actualized people. I think it's important that judges see that clients, this is an incredibly intimate relationship. The average federal case that I handle lasts about a year. These are emotionally very trying times for the client. So this may be the only out queer person that they have met. And that probably makes a difference. I don't want to idealize it too much, but, I think it does make a difference. And in the work that I do, that's probably it, in terms of the impact that I have on the larger LGBTQ community and kind of eradicating barriers. But I think it's worth saying, right? It's not nothing.
Yeah. No, I think that it's that relationship, personal relationship building, sometimes unlikely relationships that happen, those constellations. And the more that people get to know you as Tiff and all aspects of who you are, including the fact that you are part of the LGBTQ community, then when something is said where you're not there, like you said, if things are said behind your back, those folks who really know you are more likely to stand up and do the right thing and disrupt that. Not always, right? But more likely to, because they know who you are as a full human being. And it's much harder to dehumanize someone when you know the things that are most important to that person that is also important to you. There's connections, there's commonalities. And I think sometimes there's more commonalities than there are not in our experience of being human and the human condition. So anyway, that might be a little Pollyanna, but I also think it's important. And I appreciate that. I appreciate what you shared there. As we kind of round out the end of the interview, I want to ask my favorite question, which is, given some of the things that are difficult with being LGBTQ, mostly in dealing with the world that doesn't quite understand us because they haven't built those relationships, what from your lived experiences, the good, the bad, everything else, that allows you to stand out in your work and being an out entrepreneur, and being LGBTQ, from those lived experiences, what do you view as something that I call superpowers, right? That are these rainbow superpowers that allow you to shine, and sometimes those superpowers are honed and refined, kind of shaped by the fires of the less than stellar things that have happened to us.
Well, Rhodes, we were outlaws before Lawrence v. Texas. We were really, just by virtue of who we were lawbreakers for a long time. And we've always been historically people who have occupied different worlds at once. And, I'm ashamed to say in some respects, I practiced, I would say probably the first few years of my law career and law school, was a little bit of a hazy twilight in out sort of kind of. I don't think it, people needed a very highly developed gaydar to figure out, what was probably going on with me. But I certainly I have the benefit of all of the real work that activists have done now, and I can just let it all hang out and I can let it help me in my work. And so I think the superpower is, I can travel through different worlds. That is in many ways a privilege, but it's a privilege that I feel like I can employ on behalf of clients that's helpful. That's a weird life skill that we older people, sort of in the queer community have had to develop. And I do think it helps me be more imaginative. Again, I can't claim a commonality of lived experience with my clients, but I think sometimes it gives me an ability to be more imaginative in kind of asking them questions, helping them to talk to me about their lives so that then I can do what I think is probably the most important part of my job, which is to tell their story to a sentencing judge, because unfortunately, and especially in federal court, most cases don't go to trial. It's kind of like the Olympics or something. It happens once in a while and it's super competitive and hard work. But a lot of times we're reducing harm and we're just trying to mitigate harm and we're trying to create a path forward for a client under the very best circumstances that we can. And that can't happen unless we can make everybody appreciate at sort of a cellular level that these are people who have a story. And so I do think that the kind of like gay superpower that you're talking about, at least in my case, like it has made me a better asker of questions, a more sensitive listener, someone who is better at imagining what it's like to be sort of on the outside. Those are skills that are really important in criminal defense, honestly.
Yeah. Well, it's one of those things like you're describing, kind of in the space that I'm in, like the concept of code switching, where it's like there's kind of the dominant, like, this is how we talk as lawyers when we're in the courtroom, right? And then when you're at home and you're with like your queer friends and family, it's like there's a whole different language, and you have that ability of going in and out of these different worlds. And I can imagine in many aspects of your life, including, the work that you do, that ability to adapt, and to know your audience, being able to ask questions of, just kind of like the thinking of what I mean, you're querying the way that critical thought is done, right? Like in some ways where, there's things that are said, and the curiosity of like, I wonder like if this person is also code switching, and it may be different for different reasons.
Right.
How can I tap into that language to get the information that I need to get to do my best work, right? So,
And well, sometimes I'll even say like, well, if you were telling this to your grandma, like, how would you say it?
Yeah.
If you were telling this to your cousin, how would you say it? So yes, I mean, a lot of times, and then sometimes I have to explain why I'm saying that same thing differently, to the federal district court judge who's 70 and white.
Yeah.
And went to Yale or whatever, and it's helpful.
It's a real skill. I really appreciate you articulating that. I know for our audience, I'm sure there's other folks nodding their heads like, yep, totally do that. And it definitely is a superpower. So my last question for you before we find out where to find you online is, knowing that there are a number of folks listening who have not yet taken that entrepreneurial leap, what kind of advice or guidance would you give before stepping off and, moving on to greener pastures, which is being your own boss?
I mean, that's such a good question, and I'm so the wrong person to ask. But I mean, one thing I would say is to really, if you have a partner, if you're single, it's a different analysis. But if you have a partner, to really prepare the partner for the instability that might follow. If you're going to jump off a cliff and go into business for yourself, if you're going to eschew a paycheck job or something like that, like it's an adjustment for your whole household. Obviously, everyone thinks about this stuff. So, I'm sure I'm not saying things that people don't know, but to really try to do more than you think you need to bring your partner along. And if you're with someone and you're thinking, I'm not sure this is going to work out in the long term, well, then it's definitely not going to work out if you're going into business for yourself and you're about to assume a high level of stress and financial risk. Like the choice of a partner, a romantic partner, a share everything with partner, I think is so essential to the professional choice that you make to become your own boss. You don't necessarily think of it as your first consideration, but it's super important.
I love that. We've talked about this a little bit on the show, and I've mentioned this a couple times before. I'm like, if the podcast exists, please send it to me. But I feel like there's an opening in the space of entrepreneurship where it's about navigating that piece, navigating, you are your own business owner, you started your business, you're assuming all this risk. How do you maintain a healthy relationship with your significant other, your partner, your spouse, like whoever, and if those folks they're not in the entrepreneur space. So there's something there. I don't know, maybe you and Rowie want to do it. So, but anyway, so there's the opportunity in podcast land if you're interested in that. So my last question, where do we find you online? How do we learn more about you? People are in Oregon and they're like, I want to work with Tiff or.
Oh, that's so nice. Well, my super duper awesome partner helped me design a website that I feel comfortable with because I feel like it's like kind of who I am. So you can go to harrisdefense.com You can find me.
Yeah. Well, we'll feature that in the show notes. I had the chance of looking at the site today. It looks beautiful. So awesome job. Really does, like, your personality shines through on that. And that's not easy to do. So kudos to the website. Thank you for spending so much time on the show. This was awesome. And I want to thank you, Tiff, for being here. I want to thank everyone who's tuned in. This was a really great episode, and I encourage you to give it another listen, in particular on those things that you can be doing to build a more anti-racist business. So for details from today's conversation, you can go to outentrepreneur.com and we will hook you up with the show notes. You can also subscribe to the newsletter if you want to stay in touch and see guest profiles like the amazing Tiff Harris. New episodes come out every Tuesday, so tune into our next episode next week. Fresh new perspectives from out bosses, and please keep showing up as authentically as you want at work and in life. And we'll talk again next week. Thank you.